Great. Well, good morning. Obviously, it's an exciting time to get everyone in the same space who care about the green economy. But in view of making sure the rest of today's session stay on time, I'm going to start as other people start to stream in. So good morning, everyone. My name is Sing Ying. I'm the head of Southeast Asia for the Carbon Trust in Singapore. The Carbon Trust is a consultancy and advisory firm, and we support governments with technical and policy advisory. We support corporates with advisory to help them in their journey in decarbonization. And we support financial institutions as they build taxonomies and frameworks to help redirect capital to sustainable economic activities. We've been very privileged in Vietnam. We've done a couple of small pieces of work, but today I think the focus is on our panelists who really make side policy think tanks, actual practitioners, and as well as entities that help companies to verify in terms of the credentials for green bonds, and consultants who really support companies on their journey as they think about navigating how difficult it is to raise green capital. So I'm very happy today. Why is it exciting for me today here to be moderating this panel? I started my career out as a banker in Southeast Asia before I started working on climate change. So the last 2 to 3 years has been very, very exciting for our region. We've started to see the momentum, the interest in capital providers to want to think about how to direct capital to sustainable economic activities. Taxonomies are one of the many tools that we have on hand to help them in this journey. And so today, our panelists, we're all going to explore, starting from the very simple things. Why do we need taxonomies in the first place? How is it now working? Is it really supporting the acceleration that we need to see as this region and as Vietnam try to get to net zero goals? So let me quickly introduce my panel. First, from the left to the right, first I have Mr. Nguyen An Dong. He's the director at the Central Institute of Economics Management. He holds a Bachelor of Economics and Master of Economics from Australian National University and has joined CIEM since 2005. He's right now the director of the Department of General Economic Issues and Integration Studies, working on various important research and policy recommendations to the government of Vietnam on issues like economic integration, macroeconomic policies, supply chain integration, as well as digital economy and green growth. In his role, he is also extensively cooperating with APEC and ASEAN. For example, since 2019, Mr. Nguyen represents CIEM at the ASEAN Plus 6 Regional Institute Network and coordinated by the Bangkok Research Center and IDE JETRO. Next, we have Ms. Megan Lawson, who is partner at ERM and the country manager for Vietnam. Meg is a passionate business leader in the sustainability field. She's been working in this space for over 26 years across Southeast Asia, Australia, Russia, Netherlands, and Italy. Out of the 22 years that she spent in ERM, she spent 14 of it as partner, and now as Vietnam's general director and country manager, she is leading the team here to look into how to help ERM's global clients with interests in Southeast Asia to look at, as well as Vietnamese companies, to look at ESG management, especially as they start to see it as an opportunity to create business value. Next, I have Mr. Mark Stewart. Mark Stewart's the founder and managing partner of Allotrope Partners, a merchant bank and advisory firm that is very focused on the clean economy transition. He has been involved in global emission reduction space since 1993. He co-founded EcoSecurities in 1997, became the largest carbon project platform under the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, and then IPO'd in 2005 and subsequently purchased for JP Morgan. So supported a business in the carbon space very successfully. He has been on the board of Verified Carbon Standards since its inception in 2008. and also spent 4 years as the board of International Emissions Trading Association. Right now, he's an advisory board member to the Grantham Institute of Climate Change and Environment at the London School of Economics. To my right, we have Mr. Nguyen Quang Tuan. He's the CEO at Fin Group. Fin Group right now is a CBI-approved verifier of green bonds and provides this external review advisory services to companies in Vietnam. Tuan has over 25 years of extensive experience working in the market research, in market entry advisory services, M&A, and due diligence. And prior to founding Fin Group, he was a manager at PwC in Vietnam and Australia. Lastly, but definitely not the least, we have Prof. Bui Tui Mai Hoi. She is the Dean at the Sustainable Finance Institute here at the University of Economics in Ho Chi Minh City. She spent over 30 years teaching in the field of finance, covering a very wide area in terms of banking, public finance, sustainable finance, and sustainable governance. Prior to her role as the Dean at UEH, she was also the Dean of Faculty of Public Finance at UEH. She is a pioneer in building and developing training programs around sustainable finance and sustainable governance in Vietnam, and has published several articles on this internationally in internationally specialized journals. So thank you very much, all of you here today. As you can see, we have a panel that represents a wide range of views, and hopefully helps us understand why we need to accelerate the trajectory here in Vietnam in terms of taxonomies. But let's start. Let's start with understanding what we mean when we're talking about green and sustainable finance taxonomies and why they're important. Hoi, maybe you want to start, help us understand this space a little bit. What are green and sustainable finance taxonomies? Why is it important to even start classifying sustainable economic activities? And if you could share, based on your research and experience, what motivates the creation of taxonomies internationally, regionally, and here in Vietnam?
Thank you, Cindy, for the question. As you know, the global transition toward a low-carbon economy requires a clear regulation so that all stakeholders, including government, companies, investors, households, and civil society, know how the action contribute to this transition. Green taxonomy is a system that aims to determine whether an economic activity is good for the environment or not. This system is fundamentally a set of criteria and standards used to identify and distinguish sustainable activities from those that harm the environment. It creates an equal opportunity for companies, investors, policymakers to access, provide, and monitor sustainable financing for achieving net zero goals. For example, in Vietnam, since 2015, Directive 03 requires commercial banks submit quarterly report to the state bank about the ratio of green lending. At that time, commercial banks find it difficult to determine whether their lending are eco-friendly without clear climate criteria and standards. So for investors, green taxonomy offers a clear roadmap for evaluating the sustainability of potential investment. By using this taxonomy, investors can make choices that not only generate financial return, but also contribute to a sustainable future. Many studies show that a positive relationship of ESG performance on financial performance. For companies, green taxonomy help them to run their business in the way that attract investors and customers who are aware of the environment. This also simplify following regulation and staying competitive in a market that care a lot about being green. For policymakers, green taxonomy is a tool to attract capital for achieving sustainable development goals. Internationally, green taxonomy encourages countries to work together and share information. By using common standard and regulation, it makes easier for countries to invest in eco-friendly projects across borders and help the world to address climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for setting the stage about why taxonomies and how taxonomy can be really the driving force behind a trajectory of directing capital towards a more sustainable future even for a growing economy here in Vietnam. Given that, I wanted to maybe pose the next question to An. In view of that, in view of how important it is to think about taxonomies and directing things towards the right type of economic activities, what are some of the categories of economic activity that's now being considered in Vietnam to be part of a green and sustainable finance taxonomy? And do you see this really as a critical path if Vietnam is to work towards net zero by 2050?
Thank you. Before I start, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I think regarding the type of economic activities where the green taxonomy is needed, I think we're talking about the green transitions. So in that, we need a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach as well. And so literally, all the economic activities should undertake the green transition. So that, in the past, we used to think about some activities that are new and that are without environmental impact. For example, when we talk about the sharing economies, for example, we used to think of it as an innovative model. But over time, people start to talk about the carbon footprint of that one. And so, I think in all the economic activities, there is some substantial part of the green transition there, and that's why the green taxonomy for me it should cover the broad definition of all the economic activities. But when we talk about the question here, I'd like to touch upon some of the priority sectors, and I think for Vietnam, I think some of the key activities we talk these days are agriculture and energy and industrial sector, and also the last one is also the construction materials. All these things are the important sectors that are important in the sense that they have a lot of implication for the environment. And the second thing is they have very important. They have some their innovations will also drive economic growth and economic recovery. And the third one is the reduction of emission. And for the green transition in these areas require technologies and innovations, and these are the priority sectors. But you may give critics saying that talking about agriculture, manufacturing, and energies and construction materials, they are too broad. But the problem is these activities. When we talk about green taxonomy, we should give some sort of flexibility for the investor so that they can develop some projects that cover different activities that range from agriculture to energy. For example, when we talk about circular economy, one of my favorite topics, in agriculture, it's very hard to talk about circular economy in agriculture without energy. And so if you if you adopt a very strict definition about the scope some economic activities there. You leave out some possibility for the investor to innovate. And I think about the role taxonomy for enabling Vietnam to reach the net zero goal by 2050. I have two brief points. The first one is very direct because the taxonomy enables the investors to get the funding from the creditors, which is very important. They have a benchmark for domestic creditors and domestic international creditors to support the green project, which is very important. But the second thing is the taxonomy is not something we had overnight. It's a process. So over time, we start to, in that kind of process, the investor, the regulators, and different stakeholders engage in the discussion, and they get the mutual understanding, so that they know better about the taxonomy that evolve over time. And with that, they start to develop a greater consensus. They develop mutual understandings, and that is crucial for the long-term transition toward a greener economy.
Thank you for sharing it. I really like that point that you bring up, which is that even though there are categories of economic activities in the sustainability space, sometimes we do see the merging or the need to think about two types of activities in one. And I think that kind of leads me to Meg, because you work across Southeast Asia, and ERM works across Southeast Asia, and obviously taxonomies have been picking up pace in this region. There's the ASEAN taxonomy, but individual countries also have them. Do you see differences and similarities, maybe in terms of approach, in terms of the range of sectors they want to cover, or in terms of trying to cater for such complexities when it comes to directing sustainable finance?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and good morning, everybody. Before we even look at just ASEAN, it's important to recognise that the global financial community that has the capital that we want to sort of accelerate the speed in which it can be deployed into more sustainable investments. That's a global system. So before we get to ASEAN, I think it's just worth taking a minute just to mention the EU taxonomy, which is probably recognised as one of the most sort of robust and in place and mature at the moment. It's still only a few years old, but that just shows you how fast this space is moving. And the idea about each of the taxonomies, regardless of which country or jurisdiction, we need to be mindful that the taxonomies need to work together, because the capital is typically global capital, and so we've got to have an intertwined system of taxonomies across the world. Here in ASEAN, there is the second draft of the ASEAN taxonomy was released just earlier of this year. So that is meant to dovetail in not only to the 10 member states of ASEAN, but also, reflect and align somewhat with the other global taxonomies that are out there, such as the EU one. There are versions of taxonomies available for some of the ASEAN states, so you can see that there's some publications already, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam as well. The comment that I would make is that, as we were just saying, it's a bit of an evolution. So none of these taxonomies have fully grown yet. So let's say they might be in their first draft, they might be in their second draft. They're kind of a step-by-step approach at the moment. So the level of completion, I would say, is still very much a work in progress. Thailand, for example, that came out with their second version of the taxonomy earlier this year, they've just focused on energy and transportation sectors. Whereas Indonesia, for example, they've done mapping. They've mapped over 900 different types of sectors and subsectors. So it's a very different approach. I know from the example in Thailand that, it's voluntary, right? So there's still no obligation like there is already in the EU. But in Thailand, you've got the Bank of Thailand, who are certainly putting pressure on energy and transportation sector businesses and organisations. And so you're starting to see an uptake and embracing of the taxonomy, particularly from those sectors. And I guess what we see with the work that ERM helps with many of our clients is that we see an increasing appetite to start to understand the taxonomy. So our clients will be interested to find out, you know, what does taxonomy mean? What does it mean for their business? How close are they to being able to demonstrate any sort of alignment or being able to disclose publicly anything about their business in line with the various taxonomies? So there are some similarities. At the crux, they're still aiming for the same types of outcomes to accelerate that capital deployment. But there's still a difference in the maturity and in the level of detail and certainly in the uptake and awareness.
Thank you. Thank you for providing a little bit of an overview of how very different approaches to a very, very complex problem. You can break it apart into smaller pieces and try to go and attack the most important parts of your economy, or you can really take a big wide view and try to help everyone make sense of this at the same time. As you said, there are different approaches, but I also wanted to then kind of bring it home to here in Vietnam and some of the businesses who have been trying very hard to raise green capital. So Tuan, would you want to be able to share in your work, what kind of sectors have really been more successful or found it easier to make reference to international or regional taxonomies to actually be successful in raising green capital?
Thank you, Xin. So, before addressing the question, what should be the sector most potential for Vietnam, or easy to do for green under the taxonomy, whatsoever the standard, Vietnamese standard or international, I would like to share some misconception here in this market, so for you to understand what's happening. And probably in the higher section, someone could ask our Prime Minister when the local taxonomy version will be issued. We are so slow in this progress to take advantages of the topic we're talking about today, especially for funding and financing the economy in the very challenging time. So first, I think the people, including regulator here, policymakers, a lot of people, they misunderstood the taxonomy is the technical specification for some projects. It's not that one, right? So at the moment, the design of the draft tends to be regulated very details. It's not workable, I have to say, because look at the international practice. There are two approaches. Number one is a criteria-based, like climate bond initiatives or some other. The second one is principle-based. In Vietnam, yes, we are a rule-based country, so we tend to follow the criteria. It's good, but too much detail, technical, for every sector, I don't think that's work. Too many sectors in the draft version. So I could recommend take the easier approach. Go between the principle-based and criteria-based. And for key sector, that's needed for our country. Not long list, more than 100 sector, subsector, too long. Few hundred pages. I don't think that's I think I'm sharing how to make our country move faster, fast track in this domain. That's number one. Number two, for at the moment, the market's still happening. So we are doing for some Vietnamese company who need the fund and compliance with not only ESG, but the green and social bond for as a binding from investor. So that's good. So that's the second finding that we are working by, between the private sector, investor and Vietnamese counterparts. So that's happening. So I would like to emphasize my key message before addressing what should be the key sector is how every one of us could, push our, related person to move up. I hope we can have it issued before COP28, already 3 years, but not much progress. So back to the main question, what's the sector? In Vietnam, for green and ESG and so on, we have three angles that our country needed. Number one is we are the export-oriented country. So all the key sector, seafood, agriculture, we export a lot. And the pressure from European you guys push on us. So that should be the focus for the country. So let's take top 5 or 10 sector and focus on that. Easier way. Number 2 is investment, especially the infrastructure. We need around 60 billion US dollar from our estimation for the next 8 years to deliver the plan. And around, only for renewable, you know, and for others, 10 times higher. And we don't have a domestically we don't have an investment mechanism or put in the banking deposits. So where's the money from? How the financing the infrastructure? So diversifying the funding from European other is very important, but we need to move first with the taxonomy. Alignment, very important, between the local and the you know, international or common standard one. So those are the 2 areas. So of course, infrastructure, we have energy, we have solar, we have many things. And the export sectors, we have like, I don't want to on the name, but let's say pick the top 10. And some other sector well connected to the world, the global value chain, like logistics and so on. So those are the 3 areas we think that's our country most needed, and that's you guys from foreign investor and investment communities, that's most needed for our country to do. And for renewable energy, for example, easy, dim green, easy to go. But many other sectors, we need the guidance, we need the taxonomy, we need the classification, we need the standards. Drafted already, but let's issue it, and let's roll forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm hearing the motivation and the urgency to move, because it is so important to be able to attract the capital into this space here in Vietnam. And Mark, yourself, Allotrope Partners works internationally. You have international funders. Your aim is to bring those to the clean economy transition type projects around the world. And you've been in this space for a very long time. So help us understand, in terms of timeline and the recent speed of change in terms of taxonomy, how do you see that? And do you see relevance to that in the work that you're doing here in the region, in Southeast Asia, and especially in Vietnam? And what are the issue areas that your investors care about most when they're thinking about directing money into sustainable economic activities?
Thanks, Xinjiang. When she says I've been in the field a long time, I think she's just kindly saying that I'm old, but we'll take it from there. I wish I could sit here and say at this juncture that green taxonomy was making a huge difference into our business at this point, but at this juncture it's just simply too new. I mean, as a project developer and as a group that we actually develop other development companies. We actually sometimes call ourselves an incubator. So we're working on different segments throughout the region around specific opportunities that are caused by different policy frameworks or different physical frameworks and mainly in the Philippines and Vietnam, and to a lesser extent in Indonesia recently. And my whole career has been about how do you get these types of assets financed. And as it was mentioned earlier, I started off in the carbon markets, and we used to use carbon credits and and CERs under the UN system to help get projects over the top. It was just an additional hard currency revenue flow that could help mitigate risk in emerging market opportunities. These days we're a little bit more focused on the asset development. So one of the hot terms of the last several years has been blended finance, how you use different pools of capital to risk mitigate different types of investments. And again, I defined risk, blended capital as somebody taking a risk they're not getting paid to take, essentially either via grant or for concessional finance. And so bluntly put, I'm pretty agnostic as to how we get money into these types of projects. Right now here in Vietnam, we're mainly focused on renewable energy and storage, and a little bit also, but all around the industrial parks, because manufacturing exports are a huge part of the Vietnam economy. There's obviously many other aspects of the taxonomy, and as was just said, these are relatively easier parts in renewable energy to look at. But I'll be honest with you, we're just figuring out how these taxonomies make a difference to our business. Okay, anything that that pushes money towards these sectors is obviously very positive for us. I mean, forever, we've worked on these things in the process of just looking for what the tools that were available in terms of risk, in terms of loan guarantees, first dollar loss, credits to be used, either as carbon credits or other forms of environmental attribute credits. We've always looked at these as ways that we could essentially do the financial acrobatics to make something that was too risky for finance to do, to be just not risky enough for somebody to be willing to write the check. And I think where we get, sort of intrigued by the taxonomy is because we're always searching for those pools of capital that would, have a small allocation towards what we are doing. And again, as you can imagine, every developer like us or the developers we work are looking at the same thing. These pools of capital get dozens of knocks on the door.
In the last 40 years, and one of the key principles we tend to talk about is the freedom of doing business. So we tend to say if there is activities that is not prohibited by the law, you're allowed to do it. That's the key principle we have been advocating in the last decade. It's different from from the principle of being able to do only things allowed by the law. So it's a different thing. So I think in this approach, my proposals to work on in terms of the taxonomy is that you take the reverse approach, where you start to identify what are the activities that are not clean, that are not sustainable. And on top of, and that is I think this is the broadest sphere we could allow the investor to work, because they will have the innovations as long as you told them this is not something you can do, and then the rest you can innovate, you can have your own ideas, you can be flexible, you can engage. And even with the type of, we had the discussion in the earlier session about blended finance, for example. If we don't have that kind of flexibility in the taxonomy, you don't get the chance for the facilitation of blended finance either.
Meg, are there areas and regions in the rest of the region that you can see has actually benefited from taxonomy clarity, or even though, as you said, it's an evolving process in many of these places?
Yeah, I mean, in this region, it's still evolving and it's still very early, and it's slow. So that's kind of the summary of the status of where we are right now. What I would draw attention back to, though, is the reality, for example, in the EU, where it is already mandated, it's in place, and it's already part of the Sustainability Reporting Directive. So that has already captured a huge number of organisations of different sizes in different sectors, and it's all linked back to the EU's commitment to be net zero themselves as a continent. So there is, that's sort of the future, if you like, if we believe that what tends to happen with these things is that they become established and workable in one part of the world, and then it tends to, be adopted elsewhere, in a different time frame. But that has happened very fast in the EU, and perhaps faster than many expected, but it's happened swiftly, and it's strong, and it's not voluntary anymore. So we'll kind of see how it continues to play out. But what I see is that some of the leading organisations that I would look at, they're already fully reporting to the EU taxonomy in their annual reports on their capex, opex, and revenues. And they're doing that for a reason, and they're doing that to try to position themselves as a good investment or as a good custodian of projects.
Thank you. It's definitely very encouraging to hear there are some leading organizations in the region where, and to hear also from Tuan that despite the fluidity of the taxonomies these days, you can already start seeing companies, you can really start seeing projects that want to attract the green capital taking the first steps. I wanted to maybe move on to talk about maybe the data, and I think, Mark, you mentioned just now a little bit about data, right? And one part of the work that you do is also looking at data. In terms of ESG data, or environmental and climate-related data. Do you see what types of data are being asked for these days? Do you see Vietnamese companies reacting to it? And then I'll come back to you later a little bit. Yeah.
Well, the data information facilitates the trade flow and investment flows. That's true, right? And during our daily business, we have a lot of requests from European, Japanese, US recently for ESG data and for public and private companies. And that's the issue here in Vietnam. We don't have a clear regulatory framework for sustainable or ESG or anything yet, just some bullet point in the regulation. Annual report, and they need to declare this, or it's good to have this, nothing comprehensive. And we are trying to develop the information platform for Vietnam for ESG and green bond. We are verifiers, so we collect from other verifiers and collect from the public sources and doing survey. Actually, we have a big campaign for ESG survey, especially for export-oriented sector. So hope we can help address the issue on the data. Otherwise, you guys from foreigners coming here, you spend a lot of money on the transaction cost. I used to work for PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. We earn, or you have to spend, or the investor have to spend $20,000, $50,000 just for checking just one component, S. So. We need to go to the factory, 10,000 workers. Look at some young girls, suspect whether she's is teenager or not. So very expensive. So we need to step by step to improve the reporting system and data system for the easy access to the all public, locally and foreignly. So that's a lot of things to do. But I have to say, in short, now it's very limited. Look at the international vendor, Refinitives and Data Stream and all other. When click on Vietnam, almost nothing. Just something, the situation. So that's the data information for ESG and green. Green is nothing, just few deals just started. So don't talk about the green yet.
Great. So there is having some clarity around taxonomies, having clarity around data framework does allow for a more systematic approach and to be able to respond to the international capital's requests. In that space, I think one of the things that is really a big topic in taxonomies and green and ESG space now is greenwashing. I wanted to turn to Hoi. Do you see some where taxonomies are helpful to combat greenwashing? Do you see other international regions and what some of the work that's being doing there can be helpful to combat greenwashing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. In recent years, more people care about climate change. At the same time, there are more investment product label ESG that are being sold. If there's no clearly green taxonomy, this product might not really be good for the environment. A report from Singapore Business Review shows that nearly 70% of high-level leaders admit to participating in greenwashing activities, although 92% of them say it's accidental. This because companies find it difficult to measure their sustainability performance. This explains why using data-driven system is very important. The system provides valuable information for companies and other stakeholders know where and how can improve their sustainability performance. Experience from the EU region, Singapore, China, and other countries show that strengthening requirement of ESG information disclosure and ensuring quality of ESG reporting are important solution to deal with greenwashing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I add something on
Yes,
that?
please go ahead, and then I'll
So,
turn to Mark. Yeah.
It's okay. So greenwashing is a very interesting topic, as Madam Hoy shared. From the external reviewer, let me share some perspective. What happening around the world in Europe, Singapore, some greenwashing and some investigation has been made, and we witness some ESG fund. They claim they are the sustainable or green investment, but at the end of the day, the first shareholder they found out is not. And then they have to divest or exit it, and that's make a big chaos in the stock market here. At some steel stocks or some environmental not friendly. So that's, I believe, taxonomy and the other mechanism, not only the external review, but the reporting system can help prevent the greenwashing for Vietnamese market in the next 5 or 10 years. Otherwise, now we spend a lot of money in these activities, building the taxonomy, make investment, and then at the end of the day, a certain percentage of the activities is not clean or not green as you wanted or your stakeholder wanted. So that should be the nightmare in the next 5 or 7 years. So we have some occasion talking with the regulator. We advocate them. Let's prepare from the day one. No greenwashing happening in this market next 5 or 10 years. Otherwise, someone will go to jail. So that's something very important. We'll take a lesson from Europe and Singapore and other markets. So I hope you share that view and make the real thing happen. Otherwise, every company claim they are self-green. What level of green? What's criteria? What's the taxonomy they follow? It's not easy. They write on annual report, press release, no one check it, and it's a big mess if we don't think about that from now. Thank you.
Mark, what is your view on data?
As noted earlier, I come out of the carbon credit, emission credit trading world around projects, and obviously there's a conversation today around the greenwashing of some of those projects, and I think that's an open conversation to have. But I think there's some other aspects of what carbon trading and the project-based mechanisms have done that are worth sort of thinking about in the context of this panel here, which is one, we have, as I say, literally hundreds of methodologies out there around the mitigation of emissions from enormous, swaths of the global economy. There are probably too many methodologies. And while people talk about, the challenges of the credit market and how that works, the issues tend to be more about how the baseline is established rather than actually about how data is collected on the actual performance of a project. A baseline, by definition, is a counterfactual projection of the future that a project developer does at the outset of the project to say, this is what would have happened in the absence of our project. It is intrinsically, unavoidably a controversial part of the project because, again, you're saying something that would have occurred that didn't occur because of your intervention. The data collection around your intervention, around what we call the project, is actually a fairly robust system. We have seen projects where there have been, as I say, fraudulent submission of data, but it's extremely rare. And as we go more and more digital over the future around projects, I think they'll get even more, likely to be rare. I mean, you've got certain methodologies that require people to, fill in log books about what they've done. Well, yes, that is probably a problem around fidelity. But by and large, establishing, the data streams around projects and carbon projects is the non-controversial part of the carbon market. The controversial part is establishing the baseline, which is what you're measuring off of, and that's where project developers will always push the envelope as far as they can because that's how you earn as many credits as possible. So I think, as I say, the emissions trading world of the last 20, 25 years that has established hundreds and hundreds of methodologies around different subsegments of the global economy has an enormous amount to offer in terms of how these data flows can be used to establish fidelity around ultimately the the certification of financial activities under the green taxonomy. But as I say, it's because you really don't have to worry necessarily about the baseline in when you're in these types of situations. You're just worried about the actual.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think, as you said, methodologies, a lot of methodologies have already been developed. So there are useful reference points for businesses. And I wanted to then turn to Meg a little bit. In terms of companies and businesses, about the transition of their business strategy, so not so much on a single project level, but more in terms of businesses thinking about the low carbon transition that you sometimes help them with. What are some of the best practices for them to gain credibility of their transition plan? And what are investors now really looking out for in terms of that level of credibility?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question, right? I think one of the things that I want to talk about is the data, right? Because what are we using data for? Whether it's data aligned with a particular taxonomy, whether it's to any of the reporting frameworks or TCFD or any of the science-based target frameworks that we know of, right? What we're trying to do with the data is inform better decision making. Better decision making by the organisation themselves, because they've demonstrated that they understand their business and that they're going to make a smarter decision about their own business strategy, and also better decision making by investors. And investors get very nervous when they're pushed or thinking that they have to make a decision without adequate data. So the due diligence type of work that was mentioned earlier is still very, very key because of the risk profile that investors tolerate or not, depending on their own position. The best practices that we see out there, first of all, what I like to do with these types of discussions is to keep it quite pragmatic, right? So but you need to sort of walk before you can run. We need to help organisations understand the benefit of having, a corporate sustainability policy. We need to help organisations understand the benefit of having a net zero policy or strategy. We need to help organisations understand what their role could be in the, transition of the economy from higher emission or intensive economy to a lower carbon economy. And I think that that's a really important discussion to have with organisations, so that they themselves can put a roadmap together that will allow them not to get there overnight, because it's almost impossible, but they need to have a roadmap that they can put their organisation on, where they know what their target is, they know why they've got their target, they understand the business value that they will create if they're able to achieve that target, and they can demonstrate progress towards that in a transparent way through disclosure. So data is great, but data needs to be disclosed and it needs to have credibility. So there's all sorts of different systems and frameworks and checks and balances that are available to organisations to help them with that. The best practice that we see out there are those organisations that are willing to do that. They're willing to think about where they want their company to be in 20, 30, 40 years. They're willing to put some targets to it. They're willing to invest and put resources into it. They're going to upskill themselves. They're going to have adequately trained and capable people within their organisations who are familiar and conversant with these types of issues and topics. So the best practice that we see out there are the organisations that are taking each of those steps. And just to make it a little bit more accessible to most companies is that you don't have to do it overnight. You know, the advice is, you can't go from 0 to 100 very quickly, but take the right steps and don't be shy. Don't shy away from it. I really like the comment in the earlier panel today where the comment was that we can't run away from the complexity associated with these topics. You just have to manage the complexity well. And I really liked that, and I thought that it's really applicable, whether it's understanding where the taxonomy sits with all of the other components and tools that we have, but just start to get familiar and start to take the steps. Get some look at benchmarks, look at what your peers are doing. Put yourself on the right path and. You're going to be better than those organisations who pretend that this isn't already happening.
Thank you. Yes, nothing happens overnight. We shouldn't expect people to go from 0 to hero. There's always a starting point. And I think we've heard from a lot of the practitioners who are trying to help businesses, and obviously from a regulator's perspective, the taxonomy is kind of how regulators work with businesses. So I wanted to ask An, can you share some of the ways in which you think here in Vietnam industry and government can work together in terms of developing a better foundation for attracting the sustainable capital that we want to see here?
Talking about the partnership between the industry and the government and regulators in developing the next steps, I think it's important to have a common understanding that this is like we need the concrete first steps for everyone to move, and the regulations must be able to facilitate that. This is important, especially in Vietnam, because at this stage there is a lot of skepticism about new things and innovative things. And so when we start talking about taxonomy, for example, the government wanted to have good regulations and credible regulations that work. And so they are very careful in terms of developing the details and things like that. Working with industry is important in the sense that they can generate the inputs from the industry perspective so that they can develop the technical details for the taxonomy. But the problem then is that if they don't manage it well, the taxonomy that comes out of the process will reflect a picking winner approach. And that is not good for market competition, not good for innovation in the long term. But the next thing is, if the government is taking like too much generality in the regulations, that doesn't help either, because at the implementation, you don't get the details necessary for everyone to understand and to work on that. And so I think with that, I think and especially in terms of data, I agree with the earlier sharing from the speakers. But my view is that the actual data we have are just the observations of the current regulations we have. And so some of the things that are not viable because of the current regulations, and they are not reflected in the data. And so, when my real story is that when I developed I'm drafting the government decree on the regulatory sandbox for circular economy, and I always run into an issue of question by the stakeholders saying that, okay, the regulatory impact assessment is too general, because I only talk about qualitative things. But the problem is we don't have the data for circular economy at the project level and at the business level yet. And we want the sandbox to set out a small scope so that people can try. And then you get the factor, you get the details, and then you start to come back and popularize the policies. You can amend it later on. And so the idea is, it's like a chicken and egg. You need good regulations. You need the data. But if you don't have the regulations, no one implemented it, you don't have the data. And so you just need to start first from the sandbox in a small scale, so everyone can have a try, and you get the first step, where you get the good examples and even bad examples as well, so you can learn for the future. And I think that is the way we are advising the government, the industry, and other stakeholders to develop a joint process, is starting with the circular economy.
Mark, you have a comment?
Yeah, An just made a comment about sort of the partnership between companies and the government around this, and I think that that's a very valid thing, and the concerns, and it's always true that that in emerging economies, going first is always sort of an intimidating thing. Like, what is this? This is new. This is scary. This is. But there's a flip. Right now, there's a bit of a flip side in that as well, and it's part of something we've observed in our relationship. We do a fair bit of advisory work to large corporate brands, and right now the brands are very much pushing net zero into their supply chain. So it's at this juncture, it's not just about oh, this is intimidating, I don't want to be first. It's about frankly maintaining and or possibly growing comparative advantage at this juncture, because when an Apple or a TSMC or a Samsung or a H&M or anyone else, and we deal with all of those and more, comes in and says, well, we would like to increase our production in this market by 20-25%, but we really need to understand what your net zero, what your green economy looks like. So the conversations have changed quite dramatically for us in the last 12 months, where locators, industrial park operators, and manufacturers are saying, no, we really need to figure this out. And so now, again, the truth is, as was said earlier, there is not enough immediately available capital to do all of that at once, and therefore this taxonomy construct that is emerging will be very helpful for that over time. But again, recognize it's no longer just the, oh, if I do this and clean him, I'm a good guy, then maybe something good will happen. The flip side is now, if I do this, there's a better chance something bad won't happen, which is, someone else, someone basically saying, I'm going to take my production, I'm going to bring it to Thailand, or I'm going to bring it to Bangladesh, or whatever it may be. So the dynamic is not what it was the first 25 years of my career. The dynamic is really now changing, where there's a pull on the green, you could call it the green taxonomy or green products or whatever you may be, from brands and obviously from public policy at the EU and other levels. And I think that that's something we really need to address, recognize that it's no longer just about just dragging your feet. It's actually, well, I want to grab more market share, and this might be a way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that momentum that definitely started, and EU is very iconic in terms of building that momentum over the last few years. We definitely see that in ASEAN now. There are green procurement requirements even of very Asian firms. The Singapore government as well has a green procurement policy for large construction projects. So I think there is now, as you said, it's no longer this is a good to have. It is how do I build a competitive advantage, and this not only can be done just at a business level, but also from a broad and wider economic level. We do have about 10-ish minutes left, and I wanted to see if there are any questions from the floor before we kind of close this session with a view towards the future.
We have a lot of mics. We have one more mic. We can share.
Thank you. My name is Jando Zappia from NL. My question is to follow on what Mr. Tuan was talking about, the fact that a lot of the discussions sometimes become a little bit too academic, and I think putting a dollar amount on everything is the right way to measure things in the economy, not just because dollar is the right measurement, but is the most diffused one. You were talking about the difference between the price that a foreign company pays to a consulting company rather than not. How can we help the government to put dollar amounts in their trade-offs of choices, or what to subsidize, and perhaps how to incentivize companies to disclose, because for now it's considered to be just a cost.
Thank you. Look at Singapore, what they are doing. They have big program, incentivize the pioneers, the first mover in going green or sustainable. That's number one. Number two, not only on verification, but on building the framework and so on. And I see a lot of program support from different donors. I would think they should sit down together to see what most needed for this country, for Vietnamese counterparts. Number one, I think the framework for green framework or sustainable framework for certain sector, they should work together. Not this organization have some other consulting, this program have other. So I think it's not well concerted efforts on this. So that's, I would think, for two things. So some centralized program, subsidy, very small incentive for the first pioneers or first mover in the like top 10 in X sector, top 20 in the other sector. So that's very clear program and approved by the government and funding from some of you guys or some other. And the technical and guidance for them to follow. So for example, for sample green or sustainable framework for a bank, upload there. Social bond framework, upload there. So we have a whole bunch of standards, just make one time. And you know, for external verification, for avoiding greenwashing as well. So I would think should have some program. Of course, at the moment, some organization, they do have it, but quite fragmented, I have to say. And that would save a lot of money for every stakeholders. And I would think Vietnamese government is very responsive, everyone. So I would encourage private sector like us, investor, Vietnamese counterparts, do first and see the value for each of us. And then regulator, and we'll be responding to follow. And that's the good way. And I give you one example in the last transaction we did. When the European investor asked the Vietnamese company, hey, you guys, you need to follow this ESG standard in the next 24 months, the roadmap. They said no, because I don't have budget for that. The investor asked, how much you need for that? 200,000. Okay, I give you. To reduce on the coupon, on the lending rate. So for you, you have to make it binding. So that's win-win for all. And then the Vietnamese company, they are doing very happily. And investors satisfied a little bit, only we calculated only 3 bips, not, you know, it's very small. So, and they are all happy for 20 years loan. So that's happening on the market, and I would like to see more DASCAP transaction, and everyone benefited, and that's the way out, I think.
And anybody else on the panel have other examples to share in terms of putting a dollar value to sustainable financing transactions and where the efficiency comes from?
I won't give a specific example, but I'll give you a generality, and this is why sustainable finance is growing the way that it is that the capital wants to be funneled into less risky organisations and projects, and the projects or the organisations that are able to demonstrate that they can manage that risk more successfully will secure more favourable terms. So it may be the length of the loan or the arrangement, it may be the support, as we just got an example of. It may be the interest rate, it may be some other mechanism via which the lender can help ensure that their investment is going to be a good one. But they will only do that if they're convinced and sure that that's a safe place for their money to go. So that, it's just the rule of thumb in terms of why sustainable finance is moving the way that it is, and there's an awful lot of money and capital that needs to be deployed, but it will only be deployed as efficiently as it can be, into those target organisations or projects that can reassure the investor that that's the right place for their money to go.
Great, thank you so much for the question. Is there another one before we end the session? Yes, there are two. Maybe we take both and then see who in the panel wants to address them.
Thank you so much. As I was saying, I'm a management consultant, and I normally advise businesses on the business strategy. And if 10 years ago the green economy or the SEG was just like a marketing tool, now today it's extremely important and relevant, and I'm starting to look more and more into this SEG to take into consideration for my projects. And I'm thinking about the taxonomy. As I was saying, I'm more like a business strategist than a tax expert. So I would like to understand for experts, my first question would be, the tax economy, how do you see it as a best practice? Is it rather to incentivize the company to reach there, or is it mostly to penalize the company? I would like to, this is my first question regarding, I know that it's new, so we don't yet have it in Vietnam. How do you see it as a best practice? And if I may, if there is time, I would like to have a question for Mr. Andung. How important is the society agreement between private, public, and philanthropists regarding taxonomy? Because we have a very ambitious objective to reach net zero by 2025, and in the same time, it's needed to have society agreement. So how should we balance these two? Thank you.
Question first, so we can try to see how we can address everything together.
Thanks very much for the clarity and the quality of your comments this morning around sustainable taxonomies. Look, I acknowledge that they are evolving. I acknowledge that there are variable approaches in different jurisdictions, but who is or will be or should be responsible for monitoring progress against the criteria?
Thank you. Mark, do you want to start first?
I'll
Either of the questions?
I'll take a shot on the first one because, again, this is sort of, going back to, I would say that your question is very relevant, and I hate to say it, the answer is it depends. I think if you're dealing with a sector that's relatively dirty, you are probably looking at a disincentive structure. Okay, you're really trying to basically move the. I think if you're looking at a sector that's relatively clean, you're more likely to have successful with an incentive structure. So again, I don't think it's a one size fits all to different parts of the economy. I think it's that's what public policy makers are going to have to wrestle with.
Just an additional comment about the taxonomy. No taxonomy anywhere prevents investment, right? So an investor can invest in anything they want. And they will always have the prerogative to invest in anything that they want. What the taxonomy sort of philosophy and arrangements are all about is to create visibility in a robust, credible way that is strong enough to ward off greenwashing, to help some sort of traffic light system or some sort of categorisation that allows an investor to choose how green, for example, their investment could be. But the investor could always decide to do anything they want. What the taxonomy process is about is to try to encourage awareness so that the investors can make a choice that they're going to be more comfortable with to invest green. Yeah, but it doesn't, no taxonomy prevents an investment because the decision will always be made by the investor and they can invest in anything they want. It's their choice as to whether they invest in something, for example, that's aligned with a green taxonomy with all of the benefits associated with that or not. Yeah.
Do you want to address the rest of the questions? Yeah.
I think I have two quick answer to two questions by the ladies over there, and I think the first one is about the compliance or the penalty or incentivization for the firms. I'm a financial economist, so I well understand that there is nothing in life that can be known for certainty, and nothing that can be planned for implementation with certainty as either. And that's why I think there might be cases where the investor have the goodwill, good design, but after the implementation, they fail to reach the planned objectives, especially with respect to the issues of green transitions and and so I think when we look into that process, we tend to think how the investor should learn from the experience rather than trying to make a decision on what to do with the investors in terms of like further support or penalize the investors. And I think when I drafted the government, the Prime Minister decision on circular economy, we only talk about incentivization for the investors and the firms. We never include any word like penalties or punishment to the firms. We want the firms to be incentivized because this is like economic models. But of course, like Mark said, in other cases, where we talk about sustainable development, where the compliance is compelling, then another approach should be required. And the second question about the societal agreement regarding the taxonomy, we don't have a concrete answer within Vietnam yet, at least to my understanding, in terms of how to proceed with the taxonomy, whether we need too much details in terms of the technical specification in the taxonomy or the general sectors for the activities, or should we proceed with the positive list approach, where we list everything that is considered green or clean or sustainable, or we should start with the negative list approach, where we only include the ones that are not clean or not sustainable. We don't know yet, and we don't know either which one is more difficult. And so, but the problem is when we advise the government, there is nothing safe in life, and so the thing is, the government have to take concrete steps. Nothing is perfect, but if there is a second best option or even the third best option that can be pursued, that can lead to results and lead to concrete outcome by the investors, we can learn from it and do the better things.
Thank you. I think there was one question around responsibilities of monitoring. Who should be, who can be responsible? Anyone on the panel want to maybe address that?
Sorry, I forgot. I missed that question. But we have a complex issue with that kind of monitoring issue, because the problem is when we talk about the incentives for the firms to undertake green transition, for example. Okay, we develop something like that, and we also think we need some sort of like authorization scheme in that kind of incentive process. The problem, and so people complain, why do we need authorization? Are you doing against the principle of freedom of doing business? You create some sort of hectic administrative procedures. But the thing is, for government agencies, that kind of authorization mechanism also serve as the mechanism whereby the investors and the firms have to provide the information to the government so that they can provide the evaluation of the policy for monitoring purpose. But if we do things like completely free without administrative procedures, we provide support to the firms, but at the end of the day, we have no details, no data. And one of the key example I have, because I'm a modeler and I'm fond of doing policies with modeling results. But in terms of eco-labeling, energy saving labor, for example, people ask me whether I have the details, and I reach out to Ministry of Industry and Trade, and they said, no, it's now declared by the firms on their own, and it's not compulsory by the firms, and that's why the government agency have no details and information and statistic on that, and so there is no ground for further assessment or monitoring.
Thank you. So I think what we're saying is that there are some compliance mechanisms that the regulatory authorities can put as frameworks, but as you've mentioned, there's still a lot of room to think about who can and who should be doing the type of monitoring to justify progress towards a successful transition. I'm being reminded they're running over time. Thank you so much for the questions. It was really helpful for us to hear from the ground. I think today what the panel has talked about, some key points, nothing happens overnight. As such, the evolution that we're seeing now here in Vietnam, we're seeing in the region, is very encouraging. But there needs to be more that needs to be done. And we need to be a bit more bold both governments, regulators, businesses, there are already some reference points for us to have best practices to be able to attract the green capital that we need to see for sustainable economic activity. And with the evolution of the taxonomy, hopefully it will then minimize the type of risks there is for investors, the type of risks there is for businesses, and also for the general economy to prevent some shocks from happening into the system into the future. So thank you very much, my panel, today for all of that range of views that you've managed to share. I'm very glad to be here and enjoy the rest of today's sessions.